Dr. Jagadish is currently working as head, Grid and Networking Section, Computer Division of BARC. He has made significant contribution in the design and development of a new PAM series parallel supercomputers. He has published more than 30 papers in peer-reviewed international and national conferences. He has won multiple awards. Let's welcome Dr. Jagadish.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. Well, it's my pleasure to be here back again at Dialbag. I was here at 2010, and it has always been my pleasure. Well, in this presentation, I propose to bring about the computing paradigms that have evolved over a period of time, and then how they really have contributed, facilitated research, and in fact how they are really changing the way we do research in the current times. To emphasize the same, I would like to take the example of the Large Hadron Collider rate, which has facilitated the finding of the much acclaimed Higgs boson-like particle, and then later on we'll see what are the future computing paradigms, and then what are the future issues and the challenges that we need to look into. Well, at the heart of any computer you do have a processor, but then we need to understand how exactly the processor evolution has taken place over a period of time. All of us know that the number of transistors in a given area is doubling every 18 months, adhering to the Moore's conjecture. But then all things are not so rosy, because the clock speeds are really coming down. See, what was really emphasized or envisaged was that in 2006, the Semiconductor Industry Association had predicted that there would be 10 gigahertz processor running by 2006. Obviously, this has not happened. As we have many students here, I'm just going a bit in an expansive mode. The power industry, the semiconductor industry has hit what is known as a power wall. So why is it that the clock frequencies are not really increasing? Now, where does the power get dissipated in any transistor? Okay. First of all, you need to have what is known as the dynamic power, wherein you need to have the switching from the logic 0 to logic 1. You need to spend some power to charge and discharge the capacitors there. And you have what is known as the short circuit power, meaning for a temporary period of time, the PNN junctions they do conduct, that the two junctions conduct in a MOSFET. That being the reason is called as short circuit power, which contributes to about 10% of the dynamic power. Anyway, this doesn't really contribute to any switching action, or so to say the useful action. That being the reason it's considered almost a waste. And the major waste component in, let's say, any transistor is the leakage current. Whether you're doing something with the transistors in the active region or not, you need to have the leakage current that will be flowing. Okay. Now, this is again wasteful power. How is it you are going to address these issues? Suffice it to say that the short circuit power and the leakage current need to be addressed, but they have become the major impediments insofar as the increasing of frequencies are concerned. Essentially, you have as you increase the clock frequency of the frequencies of your transistor, you are going to have the nonlinear increase in the leakage current, meaning you will be having wasteful power which is being consumed more and more. But the point is that in a given power envelope, you should be able to have more and more transistors, meaning you should be having less and less power wastage. Now, this is a typical equation wherein you have got the power. See, why power is a big deal? Power is a big deal because unfortunately none of your computers, they do have any place where the energy can be dissipated by doing useful work. So all the power that you're going to put in, or the energy that you're going to put in, are going to be thrown as that heat which you need to remove. Okay. So essentially, power is anyway, you have got the equation here. It's proportional to the dynamic capacitance and the voltage square in the frequency. Well, now the point is, you have got your power fixed, you need to increase the number of transistors. What you need to do? First thing, is there anything to do you can do with the dynamic capacitance? It's a physical feature of the device, and of course you need a lot of investment, and then there's nothing much really can be done by lowering the capacitance value. Please note that what we are trying to optimize is, you need to have the large value of K. See, there's nothing much you can do. The biasing voltages, the V, it has come down from around 5 volts to 1.1 volts. Almost it has taken about 50 years. Okay. Now, again, you have got only, now if you want to keep the P to be same, if by reducing F, you will be able to increase the number of transistors. Okay. That's what the whole industry is doing now. So, essentially you are going to have a larger number of transistors, granted, but you are going to have the frequencies becoming lower and lower. Okay. Now, granted you have a larger number of transistors. What is it you are going to do with them? Okay. So, as is shown here, you will be having around, let's say, around 100 billion transistors in a given die of, let's say, 300 mm square. Now the point is that out of which you can have some as for you having your cache, let's say the static, and for having your logic switching on, so you can resolve, let's say, 1.5 billion transistors, which is a very big deal. Now the way you can mix and match these transistors and do something useful, it has become the basis by which you are going to have different kinds of architecture which target to solving your problems in a much faster way. Now what are they? As I told you, increasing clock speeds is ruled out because you already have hit the power wall. Okay, so you are going to reduce the clock speeds. Now you can write an excellent code which always resides, let's say, in the L1 cache itself or even on chip cache, but then life is not so smooth enough that your program really goes beyond. Increasing the cache memory. Yes, it's a good alternative, but then you're going to have, let's say, a lot of costs incurred when you increase really the cache memory. And then there have been many architectures. By using these transistors, you can have, let's say, multiple functional units, and then after initial startup time, you shall be having one output or one result per cycle, which is known as pipeline. Okay, you're going to break your instruction into different parts, and then you're going to execute them in a multiple way on multiple functional units. So after the initial startup period, you're going to get one result per cycle. But then you do have the problems in case of pipeline, because all of your programs, they're not amenable for it. You have certain branches taking, you have gotten certain jumps wherein the pipeline needs to be flushed. Now, the most basic problem in the processor industry is that how is it you're going to handle the branching? Okay, branching is very, very expensive. Okay, in that case, what you need to do is that when you're trying to do, instead of really waiting for taking a branching decision, what you need to do is, can you really do something else which is mutually exclusive to the instruction that is being executed? Okay, that means that you're making more use of this latency wherein you're taking a decision. So this was called as out of order execution. Okay, these things you will have learned when you had your processor courses. Then, now the point is that why waste time on taking a decision on branching? Why not compute on both sides and discard whichever one is not required by you? Like it may sound as foolish as if you want to transmit some material from A to B, where in between there is a branch. You're going to have, let's say, two sets of material. You're going to the junction point, you don't care for the decision. You go ahead, and when the decision is taken, you discard any one of them. It's as foolish as that. But then it is wasteful, but it was really utilized. Okay, what do you do with the transistors, right? So these have been the selling points for the processor industry. Unfortunately, the way the processor industry has increased, it has not been responded by the like commensurate increase in the memory speeds. Okay, the latencies are very, very large. So, what do you do that? I'll have an animation later. Now, what you need to do here is that, you can have, let's say, the states or the registers wherein you can store the value so that you can, that is the different logical processes. And then when there is a stall in one of the processes, the other processor can do the job. So, this concept has come to be known as multi-threading, or what is known as hyper-threading that Intel calls. Okay. Now, again, just to make use of the large number of transistors you have, why not have multiple cores? That is, independent processors which are there on the die. Okay. 10 years back, you never heard of all this. You had a single core, single processor. Nowadays, you do have at least 2 cores, quad cores, 8 cores, whatnot. Question comes, how many cores can be there? So, now the issue is that if you increase the complexity of the core, then what happens is, if you, let's say, double the number of transistors in a processor core, it doesn't mean that the performance is going to increase by 2 times. It varies at the square root. Okay, that means that you're going to have around 1.4 times increase. So you have got a bound there. Means there is certain incentive for, let's say, having smaller sized cores. But then you have a large number of transistors, so you will be having lot of small cores. Meaning you will be having many cores. So that is, from multi-core architecture, now you are having 2 cores, 4 cores, etc. You are going to migrate on to many cores. Again the question comes, how many can be many? Now there should be another upper bound. Okay, you have the many cores. Okay, probably you have, let's say, 1000 cores for argument's sake. Then what happens is you need to communicate between these cores. That involves a communication cost in terms of power. Okay. Now it looks something like this. So essentially, you shall be having, as you increase the number of cores, you need to communicate between them. So the power needed for communication increases. We have come back to square one. We said that, okay, we have large number of transistors, we are conserving power, we are making many cores for making better utilization. You are having many cores, because of which now we are having again a problem with the power. Okay, we have come a full circle. It essentially means that you shall be having around, let's say, 64 to 128 cores as the upper bound you have. Now, there have been certain other kinds of architecture wherein these transistors have been put to use. That is, you have got the typical graphics processes wherein typical 4x4 matrix multiplications are done. These are fairly simple ones. So in this case, you will be having many cores. That means that your computation is going to be mapped onto a graphical processing. Please note, all your computation can never be mapped onto a GPGPU. Meaning, it can only act as an accelerator, not as a processor per se, as what your regular cores are doing. So here is a bit of animation. So that's how you are going to access the memory. Then from the memory you have certain instruction or the data coming to the cache, and then from there you are processing. You want to hide the memory latencies, so this is what you do. When somebody is getting stalled, you do something more useful. This is what is known as multi-threads. You are going to have the typical GPGPU, wherein you will be having thousands of threads. But then GPGPUs are not regular processor cores. That's what I would like to emphasize. So GPGPUs can be some sort of an accelerator. Okay. Now, whatever be the case, the hunger for computation is always there. Whether you use typical processors, maybe a few multi-cores, or an accelerator using the GPGPUs. Again, you need to interconnect them if at all you want to derive larger computing power. For doing so, what you need to do is that you can, let's say, do the orchestration of, let's say, first of all, you can build a large cluster, and then you can interconnect these processes through some sort of interconnection network, be it an Ethernet or InfiniBand, and then you can do the orchestration by a clever piece of software, by splitting the job, doing the task assignment to the different processors, and then collecting the results. Okay, this has come to be known as parallel processing. Okay, typical libraries you may be using MPI libraries. Now, in a bid to solve a problem, let's say we are trying to solve a problem by building large number of processors and interconnecting them. Problem now is that, as happens in life, when we try to solve a problem, we introduce more problems. Okay. Now, what are the problems when you try to build large clusters? Okay. First thing is provision of electrical power. Okay. Each of these boxes, you may be having multi-core boxes, maybe quad-core or 16 cores, would be consuming around, along with all the peripherals you have, around 700 to 800 watts. So if you're going to have around 1,000 of them, roughly you need around a megawatt of electrical power. Now who is going to provide that? If that is to be done, you need to have, let's say, different administrative groups, probably, let's say, AGRA, some other electricity boards, they sit together and say that, okay, this is how I can provide the electrical power. So it involves different kinds of administration domains. And then you will be having the geographical separation. You're going to stack these processors one above the other. Okay. Now there's going to be lots and lots of heat, because all the, let's say, 800 watts of heat you're going to put in, except for the disk rotation and the fan rotation, you don't really much where you can really dissipate the or do useful work. So everything will be put forth or put out as heat. So you need to recover heat. Okay. So that again is a costly affair. Treating heat is different from treating heat densities. Okay. You will be having certain hot spots that you need to take real good care of, for which you need to have some sort of geographical separation involving smaller number of smaller clusters. And you have, let's say, a very huge cluster, and then supposing you should be able to utilize the computation power of somebody else, and you should be able to give them. But then when you have very high-end equipments, it is generally not done until and unless you have a collaborative agreement. So you need to have a collaboration. Now, it's always said that it's not good to put all your eggs in a given basket, right? So if something really goes wrong by in your supercluster, you should be, if you were to have, let's say, smaller clusters, you would still be able to manage the show, albeit at a, let's say, degraded performance. So you're not going to put everything in one go. So this form of computing has come to be known as grid computing, meaning it's just a form of distributed computing which enables the aggregation of geographically distributed resources, and it also belongs to different administrative domains. Okay. So this concept is known as grid computing. In short, grid computing has is just a manifestation of the solutions found for the problems posed by the building of huge clusters. Okay. As I told, for solving one problem, we introduce many, and we try to solve them. You have another way of doing that. Now, if you're going to have the extreme kind of virtualization, you migrate to what is known as clouds. Okay, that will take up. So essentially, if you're going to look into the way this is being operated, analogous to your electrical access point, you shall be having a laptop running some browser, maybe a desktop running some browser. All that you need to do is that you shall be giving your resource requirement, meaning, okay, I want maybe 10 processor, maybe of certain frequency, so running certain operating system. You need to use them for your job. That is having certain MPI library. Then the resource broker shall find that it does the matchmaking and then virtually presents the resources from the participating institutes to the user, and the job gets done, and the result shall be staged back onto the user. So by using a typical electrical access point, you really don't care whether you are getting your electricity from a thermal power station or a nuclear power station or hydro power station. In this case also, you really don't care from where your problem is going to get solved. Okay, it can be from anywhere. In short, you can think it as a higher level of abstraction compared to internet. In internet, you're going to get information. You don't care from where you're going to get it from. Similarly, in grid, you're going to get to share your resources in addition to information, or you shall be able to let's say, share your equipment and then data sets and what have you. So, now if sharing is only the question, sharing anyway we are doing using an efficient operating system. Okay. If you really go back to the early 70s, you had these typical standalone operating systems. Then if you really wanted, let's say, a multiple resource to be used by given user, you had no choice but to create multiple accounts on multiple machines. In those days, machines were very, very expensive. Okay. Now, that's an obvious waste of resource because you're going to allocate resources and then the person may not use it, may use it. Okay. Now, again, when networks become quite stable, then you connected all these resources through the network. A typical one was the, let's say, the Unix architecture, wherein you had something known as a YP, derived from your telephones, that is a yellow page service, wherein you will be able to always log into a home system from there on to a typical RSH or whatever, and then you go to another system and do your job. That meant that your resources were fairly well utilized. Okay. So by moving from the centralized operating system to the network operating system, what did you gain? You gain the better utilization of your resources, and you had the flexibility. Later on came a distributed operating system where everything was provided as a service, whether it is you have probably a directory service, you had your pool of disks, or you had your process service. Essentially, it did not really pick up. Okay, the typical operating system was Amoeba, and then Cambridge operating system we had there. So what did we gain from this is that from moving on to the network to the distributed, you had typical transparency. You never had to really log on to something known as a home. Later on, you have some sort of operating system wherein the resources can really join and view the pool. Okay, this was called as a typical middleware. So here, this came to be known as the typical grid operating system. Though the word is not used as an operating system, it's called the typical glue there. So what you gain by this process is dynamism. Then, from then on, if you are going to have the virtualization done, you really don't have to have an exotic operating system to access that. Okay, you can just have an access device. So this concept has come to be known as currently a cloud. Now, what is it for a user? Okay, much before I was born. So there used to be huge mainframes. Okay, wherein in that period, anything and everything about computers was very, very expensive and exotic. So you had, let's say, many jobs being done on a single machine. Okay. Later on, the cost of the processors came down. Okay, the cost of memory also came down. At that point of time, all that you wanted to, let's say, do, if you are a protein crystallographer, all you need is, let's say, a bit of computation, a bit of visualization, access to the protein database. So all this could be bundled together in a box. This used to be called as a typical workstation. Okay. If you are a mechanical engineer, probably you would be needing certain codes, certain, let's say, design software pieces and some databases. So you could always bundle them together and then put in what is known as a workstation. Later on, scientists realized that if you really wanted to do process simulation, okay, then invariably you need to solve nonlinear differential equations, which means you need to have something like, the solution would be something like Ax equal to B, where A and B are huge matrices. For handling huge matrices, you had a typical, let's say, a Cray class computer, okay, typical vector processors you had, okay. Now, these throw huge numbers. What do you do with the numbers? You need to visualize them. But visualization takes hardly 4 by 4 matrix multiplication, needs to be done many times. Meaning, for doing computation, you need one class of computation, for doing some sort of process simulation, and then for visualization, you need different second class of computation. Meaning, you need to have two types of computation for doing a given job. This came to be known as a typical client-server architecture, wherein you had a typical two systems per job. Again, because of the processor revolution, you had the processor's cost dropping down, because of which all the functionalities of the vector processors and the graphics could be done by the commodity processor, wherein you had large number of processors for a single job. This has come to be known as this parallel processing. So if there is something which can encompass all of them together, and then you can do in a collaborative way by respecting the administrative policies, that has come to be known as grid computing. Finally, if you are able to dynamically provision the resources in terms of resource, even in case it can even be the operating system per se or in the virtual machines, then you will be able to build almost the infrastructure on the fly. That being the reason cloud computing is picking up nowadays. So these are the different kinds of computation paradigms that have evolved over the past 50 years. Now, let's take a case study. We'll take how the computing is done at the Large Hadron Collider. Okay, that's where Bhabha Atomic Research Center has an agreement or the memorandum of understanding, wherein we are participating in this WLCG, that is a Worldwide Large Hadron Collider Grid software development. What is being done at LHC? All that you do here is that you are going to accelerate protons and then make them collide. Currently you have got protons being accelerated at 40 eV. When you collide, you are going to collide in opposite directions, resulting in around 80 of energy being used. So you are going to have the signatures of the products of this collision being analyzed. So the products of these collisions are obviously subatomic particles, and the lifetime of these subatomic particles are very, very small. So there is nothing you can do the sampling there. Essentially what you are going to do at that point is that you need to store every significant or every event for that matter. You really don't know what is significant or otherwise. So what is done here is that you can control, instead of having a continuous beam of protons, what you are going to do is that you are going to have bunches of protons colliding with each other. This is done at intervals of 25 nanoseconds, meaning you should not be, you are comfortable even if you really don't store something which happens between these 25 nanoseconds. Okay. Now, when you do this, typically the amount of data that is generated is almost a petabyte per second. There is no way we can handle that data. Now, you have got, let's say, this is a typical location where the LHC is situated. It's in the border between Switzerland and France. It's around 27 kilometers in perimeter. And in the tunnel, you are having the superconducting magnets where you are going to accelerate protons. But what I was trying to say was, you have got very huge detectors. Okay. Then it has also got enough intelligence to really weed out what could possibly be interesting or otherwise. From this 1 petabytes per second, you need to move to something which is manageable and then which is sensible even without losing any information. Just to have a look at this is 6'4", and then that's a typical detector. It's a compact muon detector you have. So, by doing this process, you are going to come down to around, let's say, few hundred megabytes per second, which means that this is how the data is collected, which means that you will be having hundreds of petabytes of data stored per year of the operation of the LHC. Just to put things in perspective, you will be having around, let's say, 15 to 16 petabytes of data. So a 20 petabyte of data would look something like this. Okay, it's if you are going to arrange it in a typical CD, it will be twice the height of the Mount Everest, much more than that. It's around 20 kilometers. Just to put things in perspective, all of your computer science students, you do know, but then an analogy makes things little different. This is where your aeroplane flies. It's around 10 kilometers. So you have the tier architecture here. So you need to have huge amount of data that is being processed. For doing so, you need at least 200,000 computers. Obviously, you cannot build a cluster which will be having 200,000 computers. You can just imagine what amount of power you need to provide for, and then what amount of heat removal that you need to address. So that's why the grid concept has been applied, and that is known as Worldwide Large Hadron Collider Grid. Typically, we have tier 0 center at CERN, meaning that the data which is processed to a certain extent, what I told you from the detectors, you are going to let's say store them. After this is what is known as raw data. Okay, a few hundreds of megabytes of data per collision is stored here. Okay, that means from here on you need to move to the tier 1 center. There will be around 11. There are around 11 tier 1 centers here. The responsibility of tier 1 center is not necessarily only computation. It is more of a, let's say, archival and curating center, where data is curated for a long time for all scientists to be used all over the world. It does not have only the pre-agreed data that it receives from tier 0. It also has the data which is simulated from the tiers which are lower down. Okay, so from there on you are going to go to tier 2 centers. In India we have only 2 tier 2 centers. One is at VECC Kolkata, other one is at TIFR Mumbai. Okay, now that is the 27-kilometer tunnel we have. Here, this is how the data is really sent across. This is tier 0, that is the CERN data center, and then we are having tier 1 and tier 2 centers, and of course you have the certain local computer centers, that is tier 3, which are generally used for only access. What are the different kinds of data that is being handled? First thing is the raw data. Second one is the simulation data that everybody tries to do some sort of simulation there. And then analysis, which a scientist wants to do with whatever he has got in mind. And there are certain non-event data. So you have got millions and millions of equipments. You have got the detectors. You have the calibration data. And then you have got the configuration details of all the computers which are being used. Okay. So these are different kinds of data that is stored, and then you need to process as is required, as and when it is required. Now this grid is known as data grid. What is so big deal about it is that in any program you are going to do certain kind of I/O. Okay, so you need to have provision for handling data. But here in this case you are going to handle huge amount of data. You have got certain functionalities built in the middleware, like the grid FTP, wherein in a typical FTP you have in the session started between point A to point B. In grid FTP you can start a third party transfer. Okay, A can start a transfer between B and C. Okay, and then you can have multiple data streams which are more optimized for the handling of huge data. Okay, so that is what is known. That is what speciality is of the so-called data grids. So all these things are done by the middleware. So the functionalities of this middleware, what is being used currently is called G-Lite. Here you need to have certain blocks wherein you do the authentication, meaning that you are the person whom you are claiming to be. You have got the authorization. The point is that here, in case you need to authorize with the machine also should get authorized to you. So here community authorization is done by using what is known as virtual organization membership service. Okay, that's a group of people are authorized together, because you cannot every time access like millions of users, or you can authorize them. So in that case, typical authorization is done by the exchange of X.509 certificates signed by a certification authority. We'll be having certain information services, and then workload management service, saying that a tier in India, they should say that, okay, once they have received the job, which are the worker nodes that the job should go to. That is decided by the workload management system. Of course, you need to have login in bookkeeping. Though in grids we really don't charge customers per se, it's done on a collaboration basis. But then you need to know who is doing what. And then You've got the automated installation services. Can you just imagine you're having 100,000 computers? Who is going to install your operating systems or the patches of your operating systems? Or let's say should something go down, some disk gets burnt out, who is going to remember the configuration details? So all these things should be done in an automated way. And then you have got different kinds of database services. And then there are many kinds of middleware, so you need to have the interoperability service between the typical GUID middleware that we have with others. Okay. These are certain tools which we have designed, developed, and deployed at CERN. It's being used. It's a typical automation service there. And what we are really proud of is GridView. This is being used by at least 100 sites around 35 countries. This essentially gives a global view of the grid, the typical file transfers that are being done across different nations. And then you've got the file transfers, the job monitoring, and then you need to have the service availability monitoring, meaning that whether a grid is there or let's say a particular site is up and running, but then is it having all kinds of services that you are looking for. So you need to do certain small tests every now and then certify that look, the particular site is up and running, it's providing all kinds of services that you're looking for. And then you should be able to generate the automated reports of health of each of the systems or each of the sites, depending on their authorizations to all the site managers and different hierarchy levels you have in the WLCG grid. This needs to be done automatically, and they are being done. So if you have time, you can kindly visit this site. You will get all the status online. And typical statistics is that you are having around 3.5 million hits, which is very good for a high energy physics community, which is quite small. Suffice it to say that it is a fact that WLCG has played a very significant role in analyzing the huge amount of data thrown by the Large Hadron Collider and has contributed very significantly in the discovery of the Higgs boson-like particle, which otherwise would not have been possible. Without this kind of computation, you would never do that. So it would never have been possible. But then the success of WLCG is not by accident. Okay, even before WLCG became, or let's say the Large Hadron Collider became operational, simulations runs were done whether to test whether your computers can handle that kind of processing, or your networks are stable enough. So all these things were done years and years in advance, much before LHC became operational. So LHC is going to be put down, or let's say taken for major maintenance in February 2013. Afterward, there will be a huge, let's say, software activity, wherein we need to take this to a much higher level, wherein we should be able to process the LHC data, which is going to come when once it is refurbished. So it's being shut down in 2013 to increase the energy levels. Okay. Now, network technology has been kind, because at the time of design, it was expected that the asynchronous transmission mode, or the typical ATM switches, which were running at around, let's say, 622 megabits, they were the in thing at that point of time when it was being designed. But then now we have got networks which operate on terabit scale. So network technology has really helped us, and Moore's law is still holding good, meaning in a smaller form factor you are going to do much more, and you have been able to do much more in a smaller form factor. So you really don't have to expand too much. So that way technology has also helped us. Now how is it you're going to access this? Okay, accessing this in India has been through the National Knowledge Network. I'm sure most of you know about this. All the institutes of higher learning, they have already been connected using this National Knowledge Network. And when any university wants to get connected and use the Large Hadron Collider grid, all that you need to do is just to write to NIC Delhi, and you get the connectivity. And please note that it's not very popular, that all these things, all the bandwidth payment has been done for 10 years by the government of India. So up to 2013, you don't really have to pay anything. You will get connected through the National Knowledge Network. Okay. Now, how is it we are getting connected? Is that we have what are known as, it's a huge pipe wherein you're going to lay the virtual private networks. Let's say in NKN parlance, it's called as VRF, that's virtual routing and forwarding. So we have got direct connectivity here. You can also join, saying that okay, you will be able to you will be a part of this WLCG collaboration. So there is a lot of action that's going on. But the point is, grid is more than only computing. Okay, computing is only one part of the grid. So the different categories of applications are, you have, let's say, the distributed computing, or let's say supercomputing. This is what is being done by Garuda, that is Indian National Grid. You get access to the, let's say, the parallel processing systems. They have the params at Hyderabad and Pune and Bangalore. Okay, that is one kind of application. And of course, you can have high throughput applications, meaning you have embarrassingly parallel applications wherein nothing is dependent on the other. So, for example, you can use it for, let's say, typical animation industry. You really don't care which frame is made after what. You need to only rearrange them. So, or even cryptography. If you want to see to it that how strong the algorithm that you have developed, you want, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 computers, you can just fire on them. And then another interesting application is on-demand connectivity. In the sense that I told you that you will be able to, or you are able to access expensive equipments. Like in our case, the synchrotron radiation sources are very expensive to build, maintain, and operate. Okay. Now, we have a protein crystallographic synchrotron source, which is exclusively reserved for protein crystallography application at Grenoble, France. So that we are able to access. Wherein all that you need to do is that courier the samples which you want to investigate, and then you have a pick and place robot which you can operate from Mumbai, and then you can place, and then you can control the amount of exposure, the radiation you want to give onto the samples, and you will get the oscillographs here. You will get the results directly on your screens, and you can publish your research work. Okay. So essentially, network did change the way we are doing literature survey. I'm not very sure how many students go to library nowadays. I suggest you go to library, but then point is that most of you try to Google something or try to find something from the network. But similarly, grids have changed the way wherein you get your information, you do your experiments, you do your computations, you collaborate with your peers, publish your results. Another interesting is you get the provenance information also. When everything is networked together, how a given experiment was conducted, how can you repeat them, how can you really ascertain a particular thing published in a given paper has certain veracity or otherwise. So all these things can be done using this. Now, what are the future challenges? First thing is keeping the huge amount of information which is done either through experiment or the knowledge that you have already gained for the next generation. Point is that everything has been computerized, but what we need to understand is that who has decided about the commonality or the format in which the data that needs to be stored? How many of us remember the format of WordStar which we used to use maybe around 15 years ago? So there is no commonality. There is huge amount of research that's going on, wherein you need to standardize on a way which you're going to store your data, curate your data for future generations to come. You have made such expensive equipments, you collected your data, but then the future generations also should be able to use that data. And then the second challenge is that, as I told you, you have got the typical accelerators in terms of your GPUs, you have got the normal processing machines you have got, and then you have got certain instances running in the cloud. Now, the point is, when you want to run a huge job, can you provision these systems, or can you provision systems across different sites? Okay. Let's say what is being done at CERN site may not be sufficient enough, or the resources may not be sufficient enough. Can you take some provisioning done for some machine at France? Okay. Or let's say India. Now, provisioning across sites is a major topic of research, because you need to provision something more than what you already have. In case of grid, what you really do is that you're going to map your requirement. If your requirement fits in, your job gets done. If not, there's nothing you can do. Okay. Now, how is it you're going to do the provisioning of dissimilar resources? See, you need to do certain hard resources, like hard provisioning. For example, a certain section of your code needs a GPGPU. So you need to have a GPGPU hard provisioned for you. And then for other computation, you would be needing typical computations, which can be typical instance derived from any cloud service. Okay. How is it you're going to interoperate between a public, let's say the grid infrastructure with some sort of cloud, be it Amazon or EC or whatever it is? So it's very interesting here. And then the buzzword is clouds. Point is that is it worthwhile moving to clouds completely? Now what about the security of the data? Because what if the service provider vanishes tomorrow? Who takes guarantee of the data, and who takes guarantee that the data will not be leaked to other parties? Because especially in pharmaceutical research, data secrecy is extremely important. Okay, so you need to have very good security measures, but that doesn't mean that cloud is not something trustworthy. Point is that it's a very interesting form of computation, meaning if you have tried migrating processes using your typical computers, then you need to store quite a bit of information. You need to have your program area modeled onto some other machine. But in case of clouds, you really don't have to worry. You can just shift the virtual image there. The image, once you shift it, it becomes fairly straightforward. Whatever you are doing gets migrated. So process migration becomes fairly simple. What is the significance of this? When you are having a very huge data center, can you maintain a temperature profile? Because as I told you, you should not have any hotspots. There's no way you can decide that. That is because the way the people are submitting jobs, that get submitted onto any of the machines that are there in the data center. Now, is it possible for you to migrate these jobs and then maintain a given temperature profile? It's a huge topic of research. Currently, the project which we are working with CERN is on this. Okay. So, lots of interesting things are happening for computer science students, and of course, basically these computers themselves are changing the way we are doing research, and then it's going to impact much more in days to come. With this, I like to close. Thank you.